And this is a really important topic for me personally. I lost my mom to an overdose 1 year ago, and it is something that I think you can only get once you've been through it. And unfortunately, those who are here on this call today have been through it, and I'm just really thankful that they've joined us. I want to take a minute to introduce you to Catherine Phillips. She is the Chief Administrative and Legal Officer over at Promises, and she has just a few things to say before we get started.
Thanks, Morgan. As Morgan said, I'm the Chief Administrative Officer here at Promises Behavioral Health, and we are delighted to have the opportunity to sponsor today's event. And obviously, this is something that is near and dear to everyone's heart on this phone call. It's a very, very serious issue. And as a matter of full disclosure, because I'm so passionate about this issue, I'm also on the board of directors of the Next Door. So this is a perfect intersection for me, both personally and professionally, and I welcome all of you to today's discussion. We cannot stress enough how urgent this issue is. Just in Tennessee alone, the number, especially with the pandemic, as we have moved through 2020, this has become such a forefront issue for so many people. Just in Tennessee alone, overdoses that are non-fatal are already 50% ahead of where they were last year. And that number is just staggering. For fatal overdoses, we are on track to exceed 2018 and 2019 right here in Tennessee. And with all of the attention that's been paid to COVID, which is certainly deserved, I think we are all, we serve our communities well if we pause for a moment and think about this population that we deal with every day and the seriousness of this issue. I have the pleasure to work with several of you all on the Zoom here at Promises. And Promises Behavioral Health works directly in this space with substance use and other mental disorders. And we are in Texas, we are in Tennessee, we are in Pennsylvania, we are in Massachusetts and Florida. And so we know that in the facilities where we are, that this is an ever-growing issue. And again, it's very, very difficult to face it on a daily basis and deal with these very, very personal issues. But I know here for us, our purpose really sums it up. And we have worked on this recently, and again, it's very personal to us that we exist to provide hope, transformation, and connection for life. And it's that for life at the end of our purpose that really drives all of this home for all of us with this topic. Again, it's very, very timely. I thank you all for participating. I hope that you will all be understanding as the panelists go through what is just imperatively personal issues for each of them today. And do remember that as we share this and you share it with your friends, that we're right on the cusp of August the 31st, which is our International Overdose Awareness Day. So I'd just like to stress that again for everyone. Thank you all again for being here, and thank you on behalf of Promises and the Next Door.
Catherine, thank you so much. And we're just so thankful to have you on our board, and thankful to have this connection with Promises as well, to be able to partner and just bring more awareness to an issue that really needs that awareness. So thank you so much. We are going to go ahead and get started. So this panel is called Learning from Loss, which means we're really focusing here on not just the grief in general, but what we learned from it and kind of where to go from here. So in today's panel, we're not going to be hearing everyone's personal stories, but what we'll be hearing is a little bit about who they lost and their own personal experience with their grief. What we are going to do, I just want to let you know, if you are interested after this panel in hearing the stories of these wonderful, wonderful people whose lives are from us too soon, we'll be doing a series over on our blog to honor life of each person that we talk about today. So please be sure that you tune in for that. I want to get started by just introducing myself. I am going to tell you just a little bit about who they are and then kick it to them to have them introduce themselves. We'll start just going across my screen with Doug Ginn. He is the Chief Operating Officer over at Promises Behavioral Health. And will you tell us a little bit about who you are, the person that you lost to addiction, and just a little bit about that experience? You're muted, Doug.
Told you I was going to do that. I'm Doug Ginn. I'm Chief Operating Officer here at Promises Behavioral Health, actually a couple of doors down from Catherine right now. Not next door, but a couple of doors down. Unfortunately, I've been able to join this club because I lost my oldest son, James Ginn, to opiate addiction. He died a couple of years ago now from a fentanyl overdose. And, you know, the interesting thing is I got into behavioral health because my mom went into treatment when I was a young man. And I had 32 years experience with my mom in sobriety. And it was an amazing transformation that occurred with my mom. So I dedicated my passion and my career into behavioral health. And I will tell you the devastating effects of losing a child to addiction. It's hard to put into words. And it's only the type of thing that you can truly connect with other people that have had such traumatic losses. And I appreciate being asked to be on this panel just to be able to share with the other folks that have been through similar circumstances.
Doug, thank you. Next, we have Becky Sellers. Becky is originally from Memphis and recently moved back to Memphis from California. And she is joining us as a community member just with a huge passion for this work and a real heart for advocacy in this work. So Becky, will you just let us know who you are, who you lost, and just kind of a brief information?
Sure. I'm Becky Sellers, and I lost my husband, actually, Seth Sellers, which was his job in California is why I moved out to California. Oh, was I muted? Did I unmute? Okay, can we hear me now? I just gave this awesome speech y'all missed. Anyway, I'm Becky Sellers. I lost my husband actually to opioid addiction when we lived in Southern California. And I'm currently working as a waitress in Memphis because it gives me the most flexibility of my schedule to be able to volunteer with different organizations. And I feel really awkward right now, so I probably am stuttering a little bit. I'm very passionate about ending the stigma associated with opioid addiction. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time working on in the last 3 years is just helping talk about who my husband was as a whole person instead of just another statistic in this. And I've also gotten really active in helping different community organizations with some of the harm prevention tools like Narcan, because that was not something that I even knew existed before I lost my husband. So I'm really honored to be asked to participate in this panel today and look forward to sharing my experience. Thanks.
Thanks, Becky. Next, we have Caty Davis. She is the former Miss Tennessee 2017, but most recently, she is the Director of School Engagement at the Tennessee Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services. Caty.
I'm unmuted, right? Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel. So I did get to spend a year as Miss Tennessee 2017 advocating for attacking addiction, prevention, recovery, and restoring families. And I created that platform, unfortunately, after I lost my father and my half-brother, both to suicide after they dealt with an opioid and alcohol addiction. Something about my father, he was the most charismatic man I've still to this day I've ever met. He was a musician. He led worship at our church, and started using when he was 14 years old. And so, if you guys are familiar with ACEs, I would say that my father had a pretty high ACE score. So I'm so thrilled that this work and this unfortunate loss and losses in my family have led me to my passion, and that I'm able to work with the department.
Thank you, Caty. Last up, excuse me, we have Megan Berry. She is the former mayor of Nashville, is how you probably most likely know her. So Megan, tell us a little bit about yourself and who you.
Sure. Morgan, thank you, first of all, for convening all of us today, and to the Next Door for having this important conversation. I'm Megan, and I lost my son, my one and only son. His name was Max, and he died in 2017 of an overdose. And, one of the things that has really resonated with me since we lost Max is everything we didn't know, and about addiction, about the stigma associated with addiction. And Morgan and I were talking the other day, and I mentioned to her, when Max went into rehab, I didn't call anybody. I didn't reach out and tell my friends that I needed to have a rehab place for my son to land. If Max had had cancer, I would have been burning up the phone to figure out where he needed to go. And I think what I learned now is, if I'd only been able to speak about it and to talk about it and to engage, I would have found so many resources out there from so many other people who were experiencing exactly what our family was experiencing. But because of the shame that nobody talked about it, we were left without a lot of resources. And I know now a lot more than I did then. So again, Morgan, thank you.
Thank you. That's really powerful. I want to start, when we talk about grief, a lot of people talk about all the things they channeled their grief into and ways that they coped in the immediate. So Becky, can you talk to us a little bit about what you did to channel your grief and how you used that time after Seth's death?
Absolutely. Am I unmuted? Hello? Okay. So after my husband passed away, the first most important thing for me was making sure that the drug dealers involved got prosecuted. I spent a lot of time pursuing his case with the sheriff's office and making sure that somebody was following up there, because a lot of times what happens with different overdose cases especially is there's this whole attitude of, they did it to themselves. And I knew that the overdose was not Seth's intention at all, and that it was later confirmed that there was fentanyl involved in his case. And I had read enough about that since he had been in and out of treatment to know that it was incredibly dangerous. And so I put a lot of time into pursuing that prosecution. And the other thing that I put a lot of time in, again, is just making sure that whenever it was discussed, that people talked about who Seth was as a person. There was this whole period of time where we lived in this tiny town in Southern California where nobody expected someone to die of a drug overdose. So the San Diego media, which was the next biggest city, was writing all of these articles about this man who overdosed in Fallbrook, California. And I spent a lot of time arguing with the media to get them to actually put his name in the paper, because the stigma associated with it was so strong that they felt like that they were protecting me and protecting his memory by not saying who he was. And my argument with that was that it wasn't protecting anyone by denying that this was a whole person and not giving him a name. So I spent a ton of time on the phone arguing with people, and that's how I channeled my grief, was making sure that people actually realized that he was a whole human, and he had a name, and he had a wife that loved him, and that his death was something worth the criminal justice system pursuing, and that his life was worth something remembering.
Becky, thank you. I think that's so powerful what you said. Just his death was worth the criminal justice system taking the time for it and paying attention to it. And I'm real thankful that we have people like you who are willing to get on the phone and argue with people to make sure that justice can happen. So thank you. Megan, you talked a little bit about this when you introduced yourself, but can you unpack a little more about what role stigma played in Max's death?
Sure. I think it's multi-dimensional, because it wasn't just about Max's death. It's about what addiction does to a family. And you know, it's funny because, you know, a lot of the things that came after for me that happened after Max's death, I had a lot of folks in my circle who's just said, well, say everything happened after Max died, and then that way you'll be forgiven for anything. And of course, what people didn't understand was that families are in crisis when you have a child that's in crisis, and that puts your whole family in crisis. And it's not the moment that they die, it's everything that leads up to that. And I think that that's what happened with, and I go back to the example of the stigma. So when Max was a junior in college, he became addicted to Xanax, and we knew pretty fast that he had a problem. And we were really lucky on a lot of levels because we were able to get him home. Max was able to admit that he had a problem. He was willing to go to rehab. There was a bed for him, and that's a huge barrier for so many families. And we could pay for it. So, you know, all of that combined together was giving us at least a chance to get Max the care he needed. And I use that example about the night that Max, I mean, I'm in the emergency room with Max at Vanderbilt, and he's having a crisis. And Max is, you know, he's a 21-year-old kid who is not going to give his mother at this point any information about what's happening. And because he's not a kid, I can't go into that room with the doctor and have a conversation and find out what's going on, because Max won't give me permission. So I'm standing outside the door, and this is the moment the stigma starts for me. If the doctor had sat in that room and looked at Max and said, Max, your kidneys are failing, or Max, you have cancer, Max would have said, get my mom in here right now because she's going to help me figure it out. But because he was experiencing a crisis with drugs, he was ashamed. He didn't want me in that room. He didn't want me to know. So when the doctor came out of the emergency room and said, hey, I can't tell you anything that's going on. All I can tell you is that we're keeping him here overnight. And tomorrow at 6 a.m., you're going to come and get him. And you're going to have a plan to figure out what comes next. And my plan was to go home at 10 o'clock that night and get online and start figuring out, what was I going to do? If any of those other things had been happening, I would have called my mom. I would have called my friends. I would have said, I need help. But because of that stigma and because of that shame, I didn't. And I felt really alone, and I felt like we had to figure it out all by ourselves.
Thank you. I think stigma is, as much as treatment is becoming available, I think, you know, I read somewhere that stigma is, at least in my lifetime, going to be one of the biggest barriers to treatment. No matter how affordable we make it, no matter how many beds we have available, we can't get people in them if there's a stigma around what is putting them in them. And I just, I appreciate your honesty on that. Doug, you also lost your son to an overdose. So I'm wondering if, as you look at James's life in maybe the years before that, do you feel like there were signs that you missed, or things that, you know, in the aftermath, you look back and said, oh, that's what that was. I understand that now. Could you tell us about maybe some of those moments in your story?
Well, I will tell you, it's a blessing and a curse to be a trained clinician, right? I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and have done in therapeutic environments all of my adult life. And I had good understanding that my son was struggling with active addiction. And I can categorize all of the warning signs that were there. But then we got him into treatment. We did an intervention. We were able to, as a family, come together and finally get to a point where we felt like he had accepted the need for treatment. He went into treatment. He had, I would say, a good 6 months of active sobriety. And it was the warning signs at that point that I think I missed, that as a family, I think we missed, because I feel like there was a sense of relief that he had gone through treatment, and we kind of minimized when he didn't exactly follow his aftercare plan. We kind of minimized when he wasn't, when he was distancing and not staying connected to any recovery circle or family support. And in hindsight, it's that period of time that more haunts me as a dad. And you know, denial is pretty profound in the family as well as the person suffering with addiction, and being able to look back honestly on it. I can see clearly that there were very troubling signs and steps of slipping back into to active addiction. And as most people will know, with fentanyl, it's just one relapse away from your loved one being taken from you.
Thank you. I do think it's something, those of us that work in this field, when this affects us personally, there's this feeling of, but I've been through all the trainings. I should know all of the answers. And it's just further proof that addiction really does not discriminate. It's everywhere, and it can hurt anybody. And so, Doug, thanks for being just vulnerable about that. Caty, you mentioned losing both your dad and your brother, your half-brother, to suicide, but that suicide wasn't outside necessarily of their addiction. There's this correlation that we see between overdoses and suicide. And I'd love for you to talk to us a little bit about that, because I think that adds just a whole nother layer to the grief that you go through when it's addiction and suicide put together.
Absolutely. And I will say that, you know, with my father and brother, both their methods were the same, but it was not an overdose. And I also want to say that this is, of course, no official statement from the state, but we do know that the suicide deaths and those deaths that are ruled a suicide have clear intentionality, right? So that intentionality is the biggest difference when determining if a death is a suicide versus any other type of death, that being and including an overdose. So looking at that death data for suicide numbers, we know it's on the low end, accounting for those that are also intentional overdoses. And as most of us know, even through my own experience, we're beyond aware that substance misuse has that and creates that increased risk of suicide and suicidal ideation. So in my father and my half-brother's case, I believe that was highly connected.
Thank you. Yeah, I've heard it in the news, especially kind of in light of COVID. They're calling overdoses and suicide deaths of despair, that whether, you know, there's not always the, like you said, the intentionality with overdose, but there is sometimes, and you don't get to suicide and you don't get to overdose if there's not some sort of deep despair going on inside. And I think for for the first time, at least of what I've seen in my lifetime, we're really starting to see that connection and see how damaging that can be when it's not treated and it's not addressed. So we can answer one by one. I want to just hear, what did you learn, and Caty, we can start with you and work backwards, but what did you learn about yourself? What did you learn about the person who died or about addiction from your grief journey and from this process?
Well, so I lost my half-brother when I was a junior in high school, and then lost my father just 2 short years later. So I was very young, losing 2 key people in my family tree, right? But what I learned about myself is that I absolutely delayed that grief. I internalized it. I kept going about my life as, of course, something had happened, but I was still dealing with, the shame and dealing with stigma from people who were supposed to be supporters. And I would say I learned most about through all of this is that I'm a lot like my dad. And I know that he self-medicated his depression and anxiety with opioids and with alcohol, and he dealt with that being self-conscious. And so through losing him, I've learned how to take care of myself. So a year before I lost my father, I dealt with my own suicidal ideation. And so I think while losing him, it kind of forced me into taking care of myself, and having that, deep connection. You learn a lot and you go through these processes, and I was, of course, at a young age, but absolutely continued to educate myself about addiction, mental health, so that I can take care of myself and honor both of them.
Doug, what did you learn, about yourself, about James, or even maybe just from the clinician side, going through this personal grief that you've probably seen your own clients and patients go through?
Well, I will tell you, the interesting thing about going through your child's active addiction is, as a parent, you kind of prepare yourself when you have no control. When you're dealing with adult children, that sense of being kept out of the doctor's office and not being able to intervene. So, my wife and I, we had talked many times about the stark reality that may happen, right? It kind of prepared myself that I would probably get a call at some point. So I thought I was prepared, and the reality was I wasn't prepared, right? I mean, there is no way to prepare for that type of event. I will tell you, intellectually, I understand the stages of grief, and I thought by being able to intellectually understand those, that maybe I could skip a few stages, and I was not able to skip any stages, right? I mean, it was real, and you go through that process. I was profoundly affected by the amount of people that loved my son. The outpouring of support and care and concern and uplifting. James made an amazing impact on the people that he interacted with. And that's one of the major takeaways I took. I've always been a person that looked for reason in things that occur. As long as I could find a reason, I could always move on and put together a plan. I'm very much a guy that, if I got a plan, I can move from there. I was unable to find reason in my son's death. And so I moved from reason to purpose. And I got a call from an old friend of mine, Rob Wagner, and he told me about an opportunity at Promises, and where I could go and have purpose to give back.
Yeah, I echo that. Really, I found extreme healing through the work I do here at the Next Door. I always say, my mom is every single woman that walks through this door, but they get the chance she didn't get. And so I think there is a healing nature to this work when you have lost someone. Absolutely. Megan.
Sure. So, it's interesting. You wanted to know what we've learned about ourselves, but also what we've learned about those who we've lost. And what I've learned about myself is that, boy, was I naive. It goes back to what Doug was saying. As a parent, you cross your fingers and hope a lot for your kids. And when Max was finished with rehab, problem solved. We check that box, and he's moving on to his next thing. And we were not aware, we didn't understand that this was going to be something he was going to battle the rest of his life, that this was going to be a chronic condition that needed attention and needed to be cared for. And Max died almost a year to the day that he went into rehab. And we didn't understand how critical that 1 year mark was, especially when you're talking about 22-year-old boys who don't think. I know my son. I know what he thought. He thought, I've solved this problem. It's not going to hurt me at all to take a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And every little bit that he put in his system that night together killed him. And so I was naive, but the other thing that I learned was that there's a lot of power in having your absolute worst day. And the worst day of my life was the day that Max died. And that power makes you resilient, and it also makes you committed to helping other families find a path so that they don't have to have this same worst day. Because as we look at, I think Catherine mentioned at the beginning, Davidson County, we'd already hit close to, by June, the numbers that we had seen for a whole year in 2018. I think we've already exceeded the number of overdose deaths from 2019. And so that's a total of families that woke up one day, either with a knock to the door or walking in to find their loved one dead, they're all going to have that worst day, and they're going to have that worst day for the rest of their life. And that the grief that Doug mentioned, what they don't tell you about those 5 stages is it doesn't come linear. It comes in waves, and you can be through one stage and think you're great, and then you're right back to square one. So naive and power. That's what I've learned.
I love how those seem to sit on 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, but you can learn them both in a single moment. It's it's incredible. Becky, what about you? What did you learn about yourself, about Seth, and about addiction in general?
Sure. Well, the biggest thing that I've probably learned about myself through this process is how absolutely susceptible to PTSD that I was. It's before I moved to California, I was actually in the process of becoming a licensed professional counselor. I'm eventually going to go back to grad school one day. But I specialized in studying post-traumatic stress disorder. So I felt like I knew everything that there was to know, and by having that knowledge, it wasn't going to affect me the way it did, only to land myself in treatment a year later for PTSD. So I learned a lot that knowing a lot about something is not going to prevent it from happening in my life about myself. The other thing that I've learned a lot about myself is how strong I really can be. I love what some of the other panelists have said. Losing my husband was by far the shittiest day of my life in existence. And I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to recover from that. And I'm not joking when I say I think I spent 2 years in a literal mental fog. And to finally start waking up from that fog and realize that so many pieces of me I let go when he died that are just now really starting to come back has been quite the journey in the process. And the biggest thing that I learned about Seth after his death, surprisingly, was how much he talked about me to other people. After Seth died, so many of his friends came out of the woodworks, people that I had never even spoken to, just to tell me how much he would talk about how much he loved me to them. I didn't know, I guess, how exuberant he could be when discussing me with other people. So that was fun. That was very fun to learn. I also learned, a lot of people have talked about the stigma so far. And when we were going through his active addiction before he went to treatment, it was very hard to get his family involved with getting him into treatment. They didn't want to have anything to do with him when he was active in his addiction after we got married. And because he had been sober before, and I didn't know him in his addiction, and they knew him in his addiction before, and they didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I learned a lot after he died about why they hadn't been involved, which was difficult to learn, but it helped me better see the whole person and the whole process of addiction, because I knew who Seth was as a sober husband, and I later got to learn who Seth was as an active heroin addict. And it was difficult sometimes to see my husband under that heroin addiction, but I would see glimpses of it even then. And learning it, the process of going through that taught me in a real way what unconditional love looks like. It taught me what it meant to be there for somebody when they couldn't be there for themselves. And overall, it really made me a more empathetic human, I believe, and more aware of that there are real people with addiction, and that it's not, we tend to, put, oh, he's a drug addict or she's a drug addict, and put them in this box in our minds in normal society. And having been through that experience with my husband, I can't do that anymore. I have to see the human, and the person that's worthy of love and worthy of unconditional love, and capable of getting better no matter what. So.
Absolutely. I after my mom died, there was this period my sister and I call like the investigation, where we had to learn everything we could learn about addiction, about her life, about her story, all these things, because we had missed so many signs, because we just didn't know. We had no idea anything about addiction. But through learning all those things, yes, it was hard, but I found so much more grace for my mom than I think I ever had for her while she was alive. It's really easy to be frustrated with people who are in active addiction, to lose sight of the fact that it's an illness, and to think that they're doing things on purpose. And for me, it was after my mom's death that I could see the severity of it from a clinical point of view, and from there's so much forgiveness, I think, on this side, that I'm thankful for, because it wasn't there when she was alive, and I'm sad for that. But it's we work with what we can when we can. So I just want to give everyone a chance, just if there is one thing that people take away from your story, from this panel, if people could only hear you say one thing today, what is the one thing that you would tell them? And I'm just going to go across my screen. Doug, you're my first person that I see.
Well, I will tell you, I guess the one thing I want people to know is as long as your loved one draws breath, there's still hope. That I get to work in an environment where there's miracles that occur every day. And, don't discount that. I mean, addiction is insidious, baffling, cunning, but there's always hope. And, I used to be very rigid about the way that I thought about recovery and how you're supposed to access that. But now we have to meet people where they are. We have to do whatever it takes to orchestrate success. And believe me, as long as the person draws breath, there is hope.
Thank you. Caty, what about you? What is one thing that you'd like to leave with everybody?
Similar to Doug, I do think it is hope. Unfortunately, there was so much stigma around, at least when I was growing up and through the past 6 years, of what recovery looks like. Recovery looks different for everybody. But now that I've met so many people living in long-term recovery, there absolutely is hope. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to educate myself until after I lost my dad. But now I'm not afraid to dive in and learn and meet people, where they are, and change my mindset of not, what's wrong with you, but what's happened to you, and how can I be more empathetic in every situation, every person that I meet. Everybody's story is different. And that's what I hope to share with every student I come in contact with is, they're resilient. There is hope. And I'm excited for the future.
Thank you. Megan, what about you?
Sure. I think that the hope message is really strong. And I think that until we discuss this and treat it like a disease that has to be managed, a chronic disease that is going to last oftentimes for the rest of people's lives, that we're not going to wrap our arms around this and get people the help they need because of the stigma, because people don't talk about it. We have to talk about it. And we also have to understand, as Doug and I think Caty both just said, you got to meet people where they are, just like you would in any other disease management. If you had cancer, there's going to be lots of different ways that you can get treated for cancer that is going to be appropriate for the way that you are experiencing it. Same with addiction. And we cannot just say that there's only one way, because there's lots of ways. And as long as your loved one is breathing, as Doug says, there's hope. And that's what I absolutely believe that.
Thanks. And Becky?
Mirroring what everybody else says, that there is absolutely hope. Death is the only thing that's permanent. Anything else, there can be hope and there can be change. And also the crucial importance of loving addicts unconditionally, loving people with this disease unconditionally, because one of the things that Seth talked to me a lot about before he went to treatment, when we were going through the process of getting him into treatment, was the shame that he carried. He was so ashamed of being a heroin addict. And I truly believe that shame is a big part of what killed him. So the more we can love these people unconditionally, and the more we can help them be okay to ask for help from wherever they are, whether that help is harm reduction, or that help is actually getting into treatment, or that help is just somebody who's, willing to be there for them when they need it. That unconditional love and being willing to be there for them when they need it is crucial, I believe, in preventing opioid overdoses.
Look like a Ginn. 650. Okay, it's 650. The truck number. 650.
Thank you, Becky. Sorry about that. I want to open it up to those of you who are joining us. If you have a question, we've got about 10 minutes left. If you have a question, will you type it in the chat box and we will get those answered while you are either thinking of questions or typing your questions. I want you to hear from us. You know, every single person just said there is hope. And I think we would all agree a big part of that hope rests in treatment. You know, this issue is not going to go away if it's not treated. And so at the Next Door, that's what we do. We treat it, and we don't just treat the symptoms. We get to the underlying cause. We're addressing the trauma, the issues that have caused people to utilize drugs and alcohol as their coping mechanism. And so I'm going to ask Kate, if you don't mind, if you will pop the TND Hope Line number in the chat box. And if someone from Promises could put the number for Promises in the chat box. Just, if you do not know where to start, give us a call. If you know somebody who needs treatment, give us a call. This is what we do. It's what Promises does. We want people to get the help that they need. So I want to make sure that I can hear Kate typing. She's getting those numbers up there for you. You can definitely find them online as well, but just for the sake of ease to have them in there. Someone's asked, I will put the link to this in our Facebook event group, but we also, if you have put your email in the chat box, we will send this out. So as soon as I finish recording it, I'll save it, and then I'll send an email out probably tomorrow morning with this. So that is that question. Does anybody else have questions for any of the panelists or about, you know, we didn't really share a ton of our stories, so there's a lot maybe that you don't know about us, but we're pretty open to answering your questions, and just you know, if any of us, I'm sure, could prevent one family from the hurt that we've experienced, this panel would be worth it today. So.
Morgan, this is Doug. I would like to bring up something. Going through the loss of a child and a loved one, the odd thing is people don't know how to respond to you. People don't know how to act, and I think it would be helpful for other people to just hear about that, right? And I think it's important for people to know there are no right words to come up with. It's not that you're just uncomfortable. There's no perfect words that are going to make it okay. It is showing care and concern that means the most. Being available, being there for people that have gone through, as Megan says, the worst day of your life, right? So I just thought that was important to bring that up. That you know, as a clinician, you kind of learn that you're not going to find the perfect words, right? It's just being willing to sit and listen, and to console, and to be close is pretty important.
And Morgan, can I add to that? Because I think that it's one of those things where you obviously, if you've never been through it, you don't have the depth of understanding, but it doesn't mean you can't give your love and your time. And there's nothing more precious to at least a parent who has lost a child than to just talk about their kid, and to have somebody else say the name of their child. And because that's a loss that, I mean, you know, I know for Max, you know, he was 22. So all these milestones are never going to come for him, right? He's never going to get married. He's never going to have kids. He's not, he's not going to do all those other things. It doesn't mean though that I don't still want to hear about the milestones that other children are having. And so I think that's oftentimes too where people are awkward. They're like, well, I'm not sure if I should say that, my son's getting married, or, or there's something celebratory in our lives because of that we want to share with you, but because your loss is so deep, we don't want to hurt you with our celebration. And I just know myself, I love celebrations. I love that other people's children are doing great. So, I want to hear it. And so I hope that people don't ever stop telling me the great stuff that their kids are doing.
Yeah, and I know I talked to Megan the other day, and the first thing she said was, tell me about your mom. And I just had this moment where I was like, well, who was my mom? Because my work is with women in addiction. And so it's very easy for me to think of my mom as the person she was in addiction. And I was at her funeral and someone said, gosh, your mom had the best laugh. And I was like, really? And because I felt like I hadn't heard her real laugh for so many years before she died, that to hear someone say that, to say they remembered her at her best, was really powerful for me. And so even, Megan saying, tell me about your mom, to be able to say, actually, I do remember that laugh, or I do remember whatever it is about that person. There's something really special to be able to do that. And I think it's healing, to get to talk about that person, because you can't talk to them.
So I had my sister, who's 2 years younger than I am. So we went through this all together. And of course, we handled grief very differently. But at the end of the day, we were grieving, kind of my dad our whole lives, as he was in and out of treatment. The majority of, our grief is this grief of a future relationship, right? And the milestones that he won't be able to partake in. So absolutely, Morgan, you're right. I mean, I want to talk about my dad too, and also hear about him and the cool things that he did in his life. So that's kind of how we relate to each other too.
Yeah.
I was also just thinking about one of the things that after, my husband died, that, there were times that I really just needed space. You know what I mean? Like just some time to be alone and be quiet. And it seemed like the whole world refused to give me that for a while. And I would have to almost like run away and drive off to the beach, or once I moved back to Tennessee, drive out to the woods where there's no phone signal to get people to leave me alone. And so I think it's important that as we're dealing with this surge in opioid deaths, and we're dealing with other people who have lost their family members in the same way, to recognize that every person's journey through this is individual, and to give them what they ask for. If someone wants someone to sit there and watch them ugly cry, then by all means sit there and watch them ugly cry. But if someone wants somebody to leave them alone and let them eat pizza in peace, get some Dominoes and head out. Just understanding that every human is going to experience this differently, just as every human experiences addiction in their own way. The grief process is incredibly personal. And everybody said it goes different ways for every person. So as much as we need to love and support people through getting them hopefully into recovery and a long, happy life afterwards, as we're loving and supporting others who have gone through this loss, to allow them to have whatever it is they need just to get through it one day at a time. Because, there are some days where I could look and see an entire future. And there were some days where just making it from morning to dinner was all I could fathom in that day. So just really being patient with people and loving them through it.
Absolutely. I think honestly, that's the perfect place to leave it, with just ways you can help support people who have been through this. And I want to thank, Doug, Caty, Becky, Megan, thank you for being honest, for sharing your worst day with us, you know, sharing, and for sharing James and Max and Seth and Caty. I don't know if you named your brother or your dad, but
And Andrew and Richard.
Andrew and Richard for sharing them with us too. I'm thankful for them. I'm thankful for the lives that they lived while they were here. And I'm just so, so thankful for you guys. Again, if you need anything, we have the numbers and websites. We got all kinds of resources in the chat box. If you want a recording of this, please put your email in the chat box. Otherwise, I'm just thankful that y'all came. I hope you learned something, and I hope that everybody has a great rest of their Tuesday.
Blessings. Thank you.